That's the trick.
Yeah.
Okay, so it is 11:02, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today at the Mays Innovation Research Center Professional Speaker Series. Before we get started, I just wanted to provide some background on the center. So the Mays Innovation Research Center is dedicated to understanding the true nature of innovation and how it benefits society. We do this using an interdisciplinary approach, and we examine how innovation advances human potential, productivity, opportunity. We try to discover the best preconditions for innovation. We try to identify how innovation spreads throughout society, as well as understanding their social, economic, and legal barriers to innovation. And we like to distribute this knowledge broadly, not only to our students, but also to our scholars, policymakers, and the public. And so the way we do this is through faculty and PhD research. Every semester, we provide grants for our PhD students and faculty. If you are interested in knowing more about our grant opportunities, feel free to go to mirc.tamu.edu. That's where you can sign up for a newsletter to receive more information. And before I introduce our host, I would like to just quickly announce some of our upcoming events. We have 3 events for the remainder of the semester. The first one is Mr. Andy Elwood on March 17th. He will be talking to us about cryptocurrency. The second one is Mr. Curtis Rogers on March 24th, and he will be talking to us about urban transportation and technology. And last but not least, we will have our signature event, our Bitcoin conference on April 16th and 17th. Some of our speakers include Mr. Tim Draper and Mr. Michael Saylor and other industry speakers. And so one of the goals of the conference is to combine academia with the industry into one hybrid conference. And so if you're interested, we have the opportunity for you to join us either virtually or in person. Registration is free from A&M affiliates, so students, faculty, or staff. And again, if you're interested in our conferences or our grants or job opportunities or any other events, please be sure to visit our website. Again, that's mirc.tamu.edu. Okay, and with this said, we're ready to get started. It is my pleasure to introduce our host for this event, Dr. Karuk Ray, who is also the director of the center. So welcome, Dr. Ray.
Thank you, Judith, and thank you for everyone for coming to our virtual professional speaker series event. Judith gave a very good introduction to our center. If you want to learn more, please visit our website and sign up to for our mailing list. So today it's my pleasure to introduce John Pittenger from Koch Industries. John was the Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy and Innovation at Koch Industries. He serves on the boards of Georgia-Pacific, Investa, and Molex. He's been with Koch since 1991 and was Managing Director of the Koch Development Group, the Managing Director of Koch Equities, President of Koch Domestic Capital Services, and President of Koch Ventures. He probably has what I think is probably the best mix of education: an undergraduate degree in engineering, chemical engineering, and a graduate degree in law and business. So that's really a superstar combination. I think that is the future of higher education: undergraduates in engineering, graduates in business, to combine both. I met John several years ago. I heard him speak at Koch Industries. He talked a lot about strategy and how to implement strategy. And since that time, he's had a lot to think about on innovation within Koch Industries, which itself is a very large multinational conglomerate of several industries, several technologies and companies all in one. It's a great laboratory for innovation, for which he will talk to us about. So I'm happy to introduce John. For the hour, what we will do is John will go through some slides. If you have questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat, and I will read them out to John either as they come or towards the end, whatever is more convenient to optimal at the time. So John, you have the floor.
All right, thank you, Karuk. Good morning, everybody. This is my first presentation on Zoom, so I hope I can do an okay job. I'm not really sure what I'm looking at the time. So eye contact may be challenging, but I'll try and do my best. If at any time you can't hear me, just send a note or let me know. So I'll try and make sure that I keep the volume up. What I'm going to do today is just cover some aspects of innovation. This will be really kind of the foundational principles upon which we built our innovation activities at Koch. And a lot of it has to deal with effective experimentation and how essential that is to success. So a lot of what we did in terms of innovation, we were rarely short of ideas and very rarely short of people who were interested in pursuing them, but we wanted to be as efficient and effective as possible. So we spent a great deal of time trying to become more effective experimenters. So I'll share a little bit of what we learned. To that end, the first page just gives a couple definitions. Innovation, there are many ways to define it. This one's very sort of functional. Discover, develop, and scale new and better ways to advance the human condition, with the emphasis on sort of practice. And one of the things about innovation in the way we think about it is, all it has to be is new to someone. So it can be new to you personally because you learned from a colleague or a friend. It can be new to your business, in our case. It could be new to your industry, meaning it's already practiced elsewhere. And it can be new to the world, which most people would view as an invention. Very little of what we did in terms of innovation was invention, probably 5 or 10%. The vast majority was learning from others and adapting it to our setting. And then experimentation, as we find it here, is just the effective testing of a hunch or an insight to improve knowledge and to inform and shape further development. So experiments don't prove or disprove anything, but they continue to add knowledge. They refine your understanding of what is and what isn't going to work. And so we're not trying to absolutely prove anything so much as learn as we go. So with that, there are many versions of this. I've read more books on innovation than I care to. Actually, I made a long list this morning. It's a lot. And I've spoken to a lot of people who are effective over the years and learned from them. So nothing that I have to say about innovation is particularly new. It's just distilled. And this process or this 4-step activity here is fairly straightforward. You've seen something like it, I suspect. First is to define the opportunity. And the second is diverge and converge to come up with a hunch or hypothesis, experiment to learn, and then establish the conditions to overcome inertia and foster growth or scale. And one of the things I find people are surprised about is the cost of these various steps. And this is especially true when we deal with our business people. Because they think about innovation as being expensive. Defining the problem, you could think that usually costs, on a scalar basis, $1. And diverging and converging and doing research, maybe that's $2 or $3. And an experiment might be $10 or maybe $20 on a scale. It's going up. But when you go to scale, you're talking about hundreds to thousands of dollars. And the thing that this chart sort of illustrates in a powerful way is, if you get the first 3 steps right, your yield in the expensive 4th step goes way up. And the real fundamental thing you want to do at the front end of innovation is stop the things that don't work before you go to scale. So a friend of mine named Roy Rosen, who's at Penn, University of Penn Medical, leading innovation there. He was at Intuit for years. His phrase, which he borrowed, was "nail it before you scale it." The other ones that kind of come to mind here, Einstein's old notion that if you've got 60 minutes to solve a problem, spend 45 defining it. Spend your time figuring out what your problem is. Diverge and converge is fascinating. I could spend a whole 2 hours on that, but there's a number of great tools to do that. We'll touch on one of those later. And then the experimentation, design, and finally going to scale. And there's a lot of people who've talked about that as well. So I'm going to focus most of the attention today on the 3rd box. Any questions? And by the way, note that the arrows go all the way up and all the way down. This isn't a short loop learning process. Every time you experiment, you not only learn something about your hypothesis, you learn something about your problem. Every time you go to scale, you learn something about your experimental method, you learn something. In other words, this loop never ends. And you could set it up as a big circle where it goes round and round, but I've found those circular charts are just confusing, so I don't use them. But anyway, this is a standard map of the scientific method. I don't think this is anything controversial. You can sort of see it maps the innovation process in the sense of ask a question looks like define a problem, and do background research to construct a hypothesis. That looks like a little bit like converge and diverge to find something, and then try again, revise your hypothesis. So this is nothing that isn't well known to anybody, or at least anyone who studied science. One of the things I've also always found missing, though, and it's important in innovation, is step 0, which is why bother? And this question doesn't get asked enough. We have people running off doing experimentation because experimentation's good. Well, if you do the experiment, we're going to make $10. It isn't that good. And if the experiment costs 100 and we can make 10, it's particularly bad. So the first problem, is it worth time? I mean, you've got to ask yourself, why am I doing this? What's the purpose? And so I would always ask that as a level 0. That's less probably important in science, more important in business. So I'm going to do one more, then I'm going to stop for a minute and see if there are any questions. The next one's probably important, the most important. Everything prior to this is you could find almost anywhere. And I guess you could find this as well, but we hold these to be the most important aspects of good experimentation and good innovation. And that the first starts with Popper and a principle of falsifiability, which is the notion that any hypothesis, if it's going to be credible, has to be inherently disprovable before it can become accepted. We think that's true in business as well. If your hypothesis can't be disproved, it isn't a hypothesis, it's a conjecture or a hunch. You've got to be able to articulate something that's testable. That's a big deal. This is really lost all the time in science as well. This has become something that's the discipline of the scientific method is really not where it needs to be generally in our country, but in business in particular, it's weak. And once you've done that and you've got the hypothesis, then whatever your results are need to be reproducible. So someone else needs to duplicate what you did. They need to be repeatable by the people who generated them in the meantime. And then your scientific method needs to be reliable. So those are the standards we always use to assess the quality of an experiment and the quality of experimental tools. So any question on that front end about the nature of experiments in innovation? Okay, and we'll go on. Now we're going to talk about the numbers. So you don't experiment unless it's profitable. And how do you know an experiment's profitable? Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but the first thing you want to sort out is, well, what makes an innovation portfolio profitable? One of the things that's helped us over the years is learning from different disciplines and bringing into other disciplines. And one of my good friends for a long time is Michael Hoffman, and he ran our risk management group. And over time, Michael had developed a really simple method for looking at our trading books in all sorts of levels of specificity. And it was the whole notion that profitability of a trading book over time. And in a trade, you always know you're either right or you're wrong, right? So the trade either nets ahead or it nets negative. So it's a much more definable outcome than most of life, but it's still relevant. So the profitability of a trading book is the combination of the likelihood that you're right or wrong and the resultant payout and losses. Or if you want to do the math, the profit is the probability of success times the average payout minus the probability of success or failure times the average loss per failure. Now, this simple equation is really important because this explains the difference between effective innovation and ineffective innovation. So take a look at two ratios. You've got the chance of success, meaning what are the odds that what you're going to do will succeed. And clearly, if you have better knowledge, you can have better odds than the next person. So you can win by having better knowledge and better skills. But the other is the payout to loss ratio. And I can assure you in a trading business, payout to loss dominates probability of win. And I'll also make my comment, which is it's also true in innovation. The payout to loss ratio dominates the chance of success. And what you want to do when you're running an effective innovation system or portfolio is maximize the payout to loss ratio for any set of probabilities of success. Now you want your judgment to be better and so forth, but the purpose of experimentation is actually, if it's effective, it changes your payout to loss ratio versus somebody who doesn't experiment well. So I'll stop on that. Hopefully that makes some sense. It's different. You don't see this formulation very often, but it'll make a little more sense as we go along. So on the trading book side, this is not new, but it's just a different application. So I'll let you, I'm not going to ask people to answer this. We'll just go through it together. So would you rather have, if you were investing $10, what's more profitable, an 80% chance you are right, if the payout to loss was 1.5, or would you rather have a 40% chance right if the payout to loss was 4? And you can do that math and work backwards and see what the answer looks like, but you're probably pretty indifferent. But the difference, so the logic is 0.8 times 1.5, that's when you win. It's at 1.2, and 0.2 times 1, you lose, so it's 1. 40% chance you win, 4, that's 1.6, 60% chance you lose, that's 0.6. So the profit in each of those is 1, even though they're very different ratios and very different probabilities. Simple enough. That's just showing the mechanics. And I did it for $10 so you could focus on the mechanics. But the next comment is just as interesting, which is assume you had the same ratio, but you were investing your entire net worth. And this is just preference theory, or there's lots of ways to handle this mathematically. But when you're betting your whole net worth, you may not want to take, I mean, those two aren't the same, because the real loss is to you is higher than just the loss of that single experiment. So this is one of the biggest problems we had with the company in a different way, because individuals in the company viewed an unsuccessful experiment as damaging to their career, which is the equivalent of their net worth. And for them, the loss of $1 million or $2 million or $3 million in an experiment could be catastrophic. The loss of the company was minuscule. And so aligning the principal agency problem in a sort of backward way was very important for us to get that right. We had to help the employees take on the company's risk philosophy and approach and understand what it was in the context of the broader company, not just them personally. It's hard to do. Now that's better. I would say that that's a better alternative than the other principal agency problem, the Enron problem, where you basically write call options to employees on your net worth, which is a bad outcome. So if you're going to err, you want to err on the side of people being too cautious, but it's an issue. And then the third one, I said, well, compare a third option. What about a 10% chance of success and a win to loss ratio of 60 or 50 times? All right, 10% times 60 is 6, and 90%. That's a pretty good payout. I didn't pick those numbers randomly. If you go to the Kaufman Institute, there's a number of articles, and one of the better ones is about angel investing. This dates back to the 2000s, 20 years ago. And they did a study around 500 or 600 different angel investments, and they both identified what made more successful and less successful angel investments. But the essence was this: 10% of the deals generated 60-fold, which was 90-some% of the profit. So it's not even the 20/80 rule, it's the 10/90 rule. So this comes back to one of the things about innovation is to have a portfolio that works. Some stuff has really got to surprise you on the upside. Nothing wrong with singles, but it's hard to make a really attractive return without some things that have some payout.
John, just a question about that, your experience at Koch Industries. Was the problem that the employees were too worried about the downside risk, or is it that they didn't have a sense of being able to capture the upside potential? What was the misalignment?
Yeah, really, it's a great question. Both is the answer. So in one case, yes, the predominant one was the fear of loss. So if it didn't work, how did that reflect on them personally? And so their leader or someone else in the organization had to let them know, no, I got you covered, right? So it's not you. I'm eating this one if it doesn't work. Don't worry about it, because otherwise that's very risky for an individual who's, maybe they might be working on optimizing $3 or $4 million a year of their profit, and they do an experiment for $500,000, they've eaten up all their profit. So they're concerned about that. The other one also showed up, and it's very subtle, but people didn't want to talk about the upside because they thought somehow they were accountable for the upside occurring. And you're like, no one knows if it could be worth 40 times your money. You just have to understand that it might. Again, that's a really hard thing to do. Big companies are dominated by accounting, and accounting counts things, and you count things after they happen, not before. Upsides and sort of scenario analysis and looking at the skew of potential outcomes is uncomfortable for a lot of people who haven't done it in the past. So one of the things we try to do is get people who are more comfortable with that kind of thinking engaged in more of those conversations. I hope that helped you on that question. So how do you win? Your people make better judgments. You can more rapidly and effectively realize gain, and you have better experimental methods and design that reduce the cost of failure and increase throughput. All of these can create advantaged innovation. So they all make a difference. So do networks. So there's a front end and origination, but on the processing side, are you making better judgments? Do you have better information? Are you doing things quickly? Do you have channels to increase the payouts? So we try and think through this, and hopefully you can innovate in the places where you have a chance to win. If you look at what we're doing in Koch Disruptive Technologies now, money is a commodity, and if all we are is money, we make very little money. above what the average is. But if we can bring things to the deal that are beyond money, like the ability to do a full-fledged experiment, for instance, or channels to allow people to get access to markets, or whatever else we can bring that's hard for them to get otherwise, those are the transactions that make more sense. Or if that technology has a particularly big unlocking value opportunity for us. So they all go together. We try and look beyond money on money. All right, so this is a simple one, but it's instructive for a lot of folks. You have an opportunity, it's worth investing if you pass both threshold operational and market. The operational chance of success is 80%. The cost to test is 4. Marketing chance is 50-50. Cost to test is 2. You can only do one at a time. Which should you do first and why? Now, if many of you have done this analysis in the past, the answer is easy and obvious, and it will be in just a minute. But you'd be surprised how many people find this completely befuddling. And the answer is, well, it's the same, isn't it? Because you have an 80% chance and a 50% chance. So overall, you have a 40% chance. And to test it twice, you're going to spend, the money you have to spend. Well, let's go ahead and take a look. I've got an 80% chance. I've put the wrong math with the wrong page, but I'll do it anyway. So if it's expected value is the same in both cases. In the first case, if I do operational first, I'm going to spend $5 million. This should be 5 and 3 million, by the way, not 4 and 2. I'm going to spend $5 million, and then I've got an 80% chance of spending $3 million. Fair enough, right? So I'm going to spend something like 7.5. And if I do marketing first, I'm going to spend $3 million. Then I have a 50% chance of spending 5 more, and that cost me 5.5. So the expected cost of the experiments is different depending on what order you take them in. Now, I mixed up the numbers in the prior page, and I apologize. It should be 5 and 3 instead of 4 and 2, but the math still works. And the whole point is, it matters how you sequence your discovery. And if you systematically sequence it incorrectly, you create tremendous waste. People who think through how to design experiments and work through the variables and the uncertainty can innovate at a much more effective rate than somebody else. This is an important insight, and when you get the numbers right in the example, it's obvious. But my colleague Tim Davies came up with this, which is when faced with multiple uncertainties in experimental design, you sequence first from the highest to the lowest, first to the last. You want to get the greatest reduction of uncertainty for the least cost to reduce the uncertainty. So if I can reduce uncertainty by 40% and it costs very little, I'll do that first, even if it isn't necessarily the obvious first thing to do. Now, let me make this practical for a minute. One of the most popular things in technology circles now is minimum viable product, right? So what is a minimum viable product? The number one risk in almost every piece of software or other things being developed in the model in the Valley is whether or not people will use it, whether the dogs will eat the dog food. And the cost of development is what it is to get it up and running. And for the most part, most of them believe they can do a very good job. So the whole idea of a minimum viable product is to get something in front of customers and watch them use it, figure out whether they want it as quick as possible, because that's more uncertain. That's more uncertain than the development. We had a business in the apparel business for years and years, and they followed the same method. It had been a DuPont company, and they had the same process over and over and over. And it went proof of science, proof of operations, proof of manufacturability, market test. And so we sat down over a long session and we said, well, let's take a look at our history here. How many times exactly does the science fail? 1 out of 5. Okay. How often can't we manufacture it? 1 out of 5. It's still pretty bad. And those are pretty expensive to get rid of. How often is it tough to make operational logistically? Almost never. And we got to the 4th one, which is how often does the thing fail in the market? Oh, 2 out of 3 times. So systematically, that process, we were spending money before we understood the most important unknown. And by reconfiguring that to get the products, however expensive they were, just to be clear, in front of people as fast as we could, saved us a lot of money because we unlocked all that money and time we'd been spending on operability and science. And well, the science you need to have a reasonable chance, but operability, science, and manufacturability. And that change was worth millions of dollars, but probably more important, it increased the throughput, because this is people, it increased the throughput by maybe double. So this stuff is not theoretical, it's actually real. All right, I'll give you a couple examples, but aside from my bad math, do people mostly understand that? I'll take it. There's a lot of mathematicians here. So, all right, let me give you some examples. And I'm only going to do a couple, but the first is Amazon versus a traditional retailer, CPG. And if you ask us, because we compete with Amazon, they're a distributor, so we compete, and we sell products to them and we sell it to other parties. If you said to me, what is Amazon's core competitive advantage over other retailers in the world? Is it logistics? Yeah, not really. They're very good. Is it merchandising? Maybe. They're not that great. So what is it exactly? And I would tell you that their ability to experiment is astounding. And so the same thing, they're able to learn and test things for pennies and dollars that in the traditional retail world, when you're selling to someone through a store, cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. And so they're able to innovate at the point of sale with merchandising and everything else, and price and everything else they do, at a rate that other retailers can't even comprehend. It's their experimentation that gives them such a massive competitive advantage. And the bigger their scale, the bigger their network gets, the better it is, right? So you combine a very large network with really good testing methods, and you can get very accurate predictions. And when you do go to take something to scale and launch, you're going to win. This is critical. CPG companies and other large retailers have to find a way to do this, and many have tried. And I credit Walmart for trying to figure out how to do it through Jet and what they've done in the meantime. But you've got to find yourself on equal footing here, because otherwise you'll be outrun. Now, there is an open question about whether success on Amazon translates to success in bricks and mortar. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, but you'd still rather do as much testing as you can on Amazon. And you say, well, gosh, you're in the good CPG business. Can't you just go to Amazon and ask for a test? And the answer is yes, you can. It's extremely expensive. They know what they have, and they mark it up quite a bit if they're willing to do it for you. So they're on top of it. So I'll leave that one. I think the other one that most people are acquainted with, I don't know how many of you have seen or done a sprint design, or sprint design and test loop, where in 5 days you create a prototype and get feedback. But it's another really good advantage experimental method using design. So there are any number of them, but those are two that are popular. So the last point I want to make here is around luck. And all great discoveries, or most of the great discoveries in the world, were not what people expected to happen. And so the Pasteur said this a long time ago: in the field of observation, chance favors only the prepared mind. Good experimentation leads to unexpected outcomes. Unexpected outcomes lead to breakthroughs. If you don't have the discipline of having an experiment where you have a hypothesis and then you learn something, you test it, you figure things out, you're unlikely to be surprised. In fact, more often than not, when you don't prepare your mind through thinking about things thoroughly, an anomaly will show up and you'll walk right past it, Famously, a friend of DuPont, who came to work for us, did this one for us years ago, but GM and DuPont had a joint venture to develop air conditioning fluids, Freon. As the story goes, some scientists left some of the chemicals they'd been developing as refrigerants in a fire extinguisher overnight. When they woke up the next day, they couldn't pour it out. Someone had the presence of mind to cut open the fire extinguisher, evaluate the material, and it turned out to be Teflon, which was a pretty nice, completely unexpected discovery. Well, the point of that isn't that you should cut open all fire extinguishers, but the point there is that they had the curiosity to do that, to see the material they didn't expect it to polymerize. When it did, they looked at it, and then they went ahead and ran the properties and discovered something they had no idea was in what they were doing. And there's hundreds of those over time. I just say that for most of us, it's intuitive that it's the unexpected that makes the difference. So the math of experimentation is pretty simple, but I would say that the key thing here is the best experiments and best come from people with diverse knowledge from diverse fields. One of the things we struggle with as a company is we want to do an experiment and it's dominated by people who know the science, and the people they overestimate their knowledge. So they tend to underinvest in experiments, and they tend to underinvest in the possibility they might be wrong. The other thing I'd say is, for the most part, if you don't do a lot of experimental design, if you haven't done a lot of convergence and divergence, or haven't used TRIZ, or you haven't used experimental design or sequencing and the probabilities associated with it, then it's awkward. And so you want people who are experimental experts in most of your design sessions. So this whole notion of diversity of knowledge is especially important here, through analogs or whatever. How do you know that who that is? You just have to learn it over time. When I had a big problem, I think it's true for most people in business. When I had a big problem and we were working on a complicated way to unwind it and try and figure out how to test it, there were a handful of people I went to over and over and over again, even if they had no knowledge in the field, none. Because the way they thought allowed them to learn enough quickly to be able to ask questions that were different than the people who knew a lot. So that tends to work together. All right. So I just gave you all the reasons that this stuff is pretty easy and should be fairly simple. So why are big companies, why do we struggle with this? I would say that the first struggle we have is that the goal has been efficiency. And so many of you have probably heard about this. There's something out there in the world called stages and gates. And stages and gates run every research or innovation program through the same process. Generally, it's sequential, and generally, each time you go through a stage, you have to go through a gate. And the sequence very much resembles that example I gave you from DuPont Apparel, which was science, and then proving that it's commercially viable as a prototype, and then getting to some point where you prove it's manufacturable, and then you finally get out and test it in the market. It tends to go in that sequence. The problem with that, and that may well be the right sequence when you're talking about something that's a small innovation, but talking about something that's pretty big and pretty disruptive, it's not right, and it turns out to be very wasteful. When you do stages and gates in a company systematically, you will inevitably get a portfolio which is low risk and incremental, because those are the things that actually make sense. It's like adverse selection. If you've got a process for setting priorities and you're looking at your results over time, stages and gates will give you good results when you have reasonably low risk and incremental innovation portfolios. It is efficient. When you're doing something with more risk, especially on market or other dynamics, it's a terrible method because it has a big wasteful front end. So when you do that over time and you apply this tool over time, you'll tend to get more and more incremental innovation portfolios. I would say that Silicon Valley took a very different approach because of the way they think about things, zooming out, zooming in, trying blue ocean stuff. There's a lot of people, a lot of books about this topic, but it is true. If what you do instead is to say, okay, what does the world going to look like in 5 years, and how is my product going to change the world in that way? That's very different. And then you step back from that and say, now how can I spend the next 6 months and learn as much as I can about whether that works and about what I need to do differently. So the strategic planning process, if you will, in most traditional innovation is very linear and very stage and gatey. It's changing now. I'll come back to an example in a minute. But in Silicon Valley, it's zoom out, zoom in, which is where are we going, big picture. Now let's come back. What can we accomplish in the next 6 months that'll give us the greatest insight about what we need to do next? That's very different, a very different mode. And on the stages and gates, you've seen it get better. Just to be clear, there are people, GE did a great job years ago, and others followed them, where they modularized the stages. And so you still had stages and gates, but at least you could sequence them, which made a lot of sense. I think the tool was there. I think there was a default that people tended to go back to the same ones anyway, but that aside, that's why experimentation is more effective. It's just a completely different paradigm and a completely different way to think about things. And I'm happy to talk about that at the end of the session about what Silicon Valley does so well. Experimental discovery in life. Well, I found this to be, used cars, apartments, Zappos shoes. I'm always astounded when people are amazed at the market cap for things like dating sites. It's one of the more important decisions in life, and the dating sites do a tremendous job of improving the effectiveness of experimentation. The potential audience, the people you can experiment with are larger audience. You get reasonable tools. Your yield's probably higher in terms of compatibility and so forth. You've reduced the cost of experimentation immensely. Now, there's a lot of other reasons that are not so positive, but it shouldn't surprise anyone that when you give people a far better way to do research and to do experimentation, it's going to be used. I think probably the other part here, though, is that most of us are intuitive about just experimenting. We all do it. Would you buy a used? Well, these days I don't ask this anymore. Would you buy a used car without driving it? Of course, the answer is yes. It happens all the time. Sorry about that. Would you go into an apartment having never seen it? Apparently, the answer is yes. But even then, you're still getting reviews from somebody else or some sort of assurance. Or Zappos shoes, which is my favorite, which is they're happy to take a bunch of returns because they know that once you find a set of shoes, you want to stick with it. Right? You find something that's comfortable, you keep buying it. So experimentation's everywhere, and people use it intuitively. But and I'm not criticizing the academy here, just making an observation. It's hard to teach and measure effective experimentation, and our education system, I think, unconsciously teaches us and encourages wasteful confidence. That is, school is all about being right or wrong, not about trying to discover better. And I've had this conversation with many students, most engineers. This is pretty intuitive. Most scientists, if you have your degree there, then you've done this stuff. But if you're in liberal arts, chances are you might not have. And in many cases, the last time people addressed the scientific method was 8th grade taking earth science. And I'm not even sure people take earth science anymore, but you did in the day. And you actually would study the scientific method. It gets very little attention in the academy. We don't teach it very well, and we don't really hone. The only way to learn how to be good at it is to do it over and over and over again. And if people are 21 and they've barely done it because it's not a core part of most curriculum or curricula that I've seen. So happy to discuss that as well. But that's a big deal. There is a lovely article, if you want to read something short and interesting, that kind of gets at this. It's called Beating the Odds When You Start a New Venture. It's by Matt Eyring and Scott Anthony, I think, at Innosight. And it's a really good piece on how it is that you consciously manage risk in an experiment to optimize the outcome. It's not just a gambler or gut feel. There's science to it. And that kind of gets us to the Einstein quote here, which is any fool can know. The point is to understand. And I think that the broader observation here is that when we're doing when we're teaching kids and doing things, knowing the answer is certainly important, but understanding how truth is developed is equally important. And understanding things like the scientific method and the principle of falsifiability and what's real and what's not real, and that something's only true until you've disproven it, until you haven't, because it hasn't been disproven yet. The law of gravity simply hasn't been disproven quite yet. Several other things that were taken for scientific laws have been over time, so, or at least modified. So nothing's absolute. Well, that's a little bit counter to the way we test and the way we think about things. I know it's changed, but I remember preparing for graduate school and undergraduate school, and I know a big part of getting into colleges was to make sure that I memorized a particularly useless set of vocabulary words that I could spit back on a test, which I think I've used 4 or 5 times since.
John, I had a question. This framework you've established on experimentation, I mean, obviously that's very familiar for us here at universities. My question is whether this is kind of a necessary or sufficient condition for, say, radical innovation in the marketplace. And kind of to play devil's advocate, I could imagine that 0 to 1 type innovations, like the creation of the first iPhone, there just isn't a lot of data you can gather before you actually have to just bet the farm and create the device. So I guess to push back a little, it seems like this framework would be more the experimentation and the iteration, that process is maybe more suitable for more incremental than the more radical breakthrough innovations. Can you comment on that, or maybe?
I don't really think so, because even the radical innovation, in a way, the radical innovation, you've got to make the first phone. Yeah, and there's a really good body of knowledge on this that deals with how to do radical innovation. And I believe it's in the appendix 2 or something of Eric Ries's second book, which he borrowed from the people at Intuit. But it goes through all the ways one can test radical innovations without and learn as much as you can before you go to them. Yeah, clearly people are taking hunches and they're going with things, but I'm going to guess that the final iPhone that made it to the market was version 18, 19. There's a lot of rapid innovation in the meantime. The first prototype, the second prototype, the third prototype, the fourth prototype. Those are going on. The difference is, and I think it sort of proves the case on these kind of radical innovations. You get what works before you figure out how to make it. And in big companies, that's 100% the opposite. Big companies want to make sure they know how to make something before they know how to sell it. Well, yeah, but that doesn't really encourage you to do breakthrough stuff. So I'd probably take the other side of that, which is I think this method is better for breakthroughs. It says, and it's used in breakthroughs in the sense of people are resolving the most important uncertainties first, and then sequentially working toward how they get to scale. Right? And I think that the underestimation in these breakthroughs, because I mean, 0 to 1's a good example. The book makes it sound as though, well, here was this idea, and then we created it, and here we go. That didn't. I mean, not really. There were dozens of versions of it. There were lots of failures. Things didn't work and did work. They had to invent some stuff. They pieced it together. All that stuff. So yeah, I think this method holds whether it's incremental or profound. In fact, I think it's probably more important when it's profound. It's just that when it's profound, by the 0 to 1 stuff, almost the logic of what we just went through is embedded in it, in the sense of you've got to get something that people want to use first. Well, that's because the uncertainty is so high. Yeah. Okay. We were Apple suppliers in some of the companies which I was on the board, and yeah, and Apple had us working with them on doing co-development of new products all the time. But as we were doing that, there was never just one version of it. I mean, we would have 2 or 3 or 4 streams in process with them in terms of the requirements they actually needed, and then you'd narrow towards it toward the end. So they were trying to figure out what their product was while they were trying to figure out how to supply it. So yeah, it's a good question, but I think it's covered. Anyway, this point doesn't, this slide doesn't cover a lot of stuff that isn't elsewhere, but I will say this. This is something that is important, and large companies are bad at it, and institutions are bad at it, and governments are bad at it, and frankly, universities are bad at it. The sworn enemy, that's the last point, the sworn enemy of all breakthroughs is a majority whose life is turned upside down. I did some work on the engineering council of my alma mater, and at the time, I was working on what was called, financial engineering. There was also an applied statistics department, a statistics department, and an applied physics department that all taught pretty much the same stuff. And there were a lot of core courses you could have taken that set you up for all of them and generate a lot more efficiency and effectiveness and so forth. And there were great opportunities to work together and come up with some real breakthroughs and things. There was absolutely no interest in doing so, because to do so was to change the comfort that people already had with where they were. Institutions are that way. To me, the best example is hospitals. And I've worked with some folks at Johns Hopkins over the years. Extracting half of the cost out of the hospital system is easy. It's not a very hard exercise. And there are many people in the system who probably know how to do it. And I'll use the example of intensive care because that's the one that the person I worked with did. You go into an intensive care unit. There are any number of sensors. They're all completely disconnected. There are rules that require physical measures. There are people doing hand calculations based on regulations from 20 years ago. You reconfigure it in a way that made more sense than what you see there. And part of the problem is no one feels as though they have the property rights or the ability to reconfigure it. So healthcare is one of the worst, in my opinion. And it's you've got deep institutional interests. You've got people who don't want to change. But if you had one place to bring innovation to bear, where 0 to 1 would be awesome, in particular, and redesigning things would be terrific, I would say it was in healthcare, which is where this is the most challenging. And then the last is just Hayek's view on all this, which is not all that controversial, I don't think, but I think essential, which is society doesn't really foster innovation because it makes people uncomfortable, and the big group has to change their habits because the small group did something different. And I'm old enough now that I count myself in the stodgy group, where I get some new tool that I've got to implement from somewhere, and I've got to go learn how to use it, right? And I already know how to do that. I just got to learn a better way to do it. It's very, very challenging and very hard. Things are subtly killed. And if you ask me, the number one challenge for innovation going forward, even with the great, the big five and the large companies that are doing fabulous things in terms of market cap and value right now, once you're successful, it's very hard to invite people to disrupt your success. And as people get big and successful, they fight innovation. And it's a real challenge. And for policy means and otherwise, that's the biggest problem, whether that's a large company or whatever. You want to encourage the small group to upend the large institutions. And small groups that became large institutions, amazingly enough, tend to want to cement their position through regulation and otherwise, and not foster further improvement. So that's the real challenge to me. Anyway, I'll leave that open for questions. I think we have enough time, or chat questions or whatever.
John, just to pick up on this last point, I mean, are there, from your experience at Koch Industries, are there kinds of innovations that the big companies can do that the small companies cannot? I mean, the narrative that you spun seems to be what conventional, we think of the small startup out of the garage kind of upending the world. That's the Silicon Valley narrative. But on the other side, are there things that access to capital or resources or people, and how exactly does that mix work where the big companies can also innovate? Could you comment on that?
Yeah, several. And this is where you need the right attitude, right? But one of the biggest frustrations for almost any startup is access to distribution. You can have the best product in the world, and if you can't get it in people's hands and through the distribution channels to support it, then you're lost. Now, Amazon helps, and Alibaba helps, and there are other ways to now you can get distribution through various means, but it's still not. The vast majority of markets are still fairly well influenced by distribution, and large companies have distribution. And if they want to push an interesting or new product through that distribution, they have the option to do so, where a startup just can't. You've got to figure out a way to make it worth somebody's while to bring a product into their channel they don't want to sell. So channels are a big one. Large customer bases. I mean, we already talked about the power of Amazon's not only in their experimental methods, but in the size and diversity of their customer base. So large customer bases allow big companies to do things others can't. Our experience has been on the manufacturing front, since we have been a manufacturing company. It's very hard for people to do process improvement unless you're in the business. So process innovations around logistics and around manufacturing, big companies are better suited to do those as well. So I think in many, many cases, the idea, now I'm not sure big companies are always the right place to generate the idea. And I think the ideal for most big companies is you want a network so you can see the things relevant to you, but then you want a culture that allows you to test and refine them. And if need be, use your power, the power and the influence that you have through your scale to allow that innovation to be better than it would have otherwise. Years ago, IBM had a software innovation portfolio. And to this day, Microsoft does. They just don't talk about it. It's private. But there are many, many different pieces of software. And when I was doing venture capital, if you could get purchased by or invested in by IBM, or later on by Microsoft and by others, they would provide you, in many cases, distribution you wouldn't have otherwise. Well, that was a big deal. That was more valuable than the money. So we talked earlier a little bit about what we're doing in Koch Disruptive Technologies. It's just that. It's where we bring something to the business that others don't and can't. So because they don't have the scale or the assets to see whether it works. Hope that added, but I'd say the same thing is true in healthcare. Without a series of hospitals willing to do the work with you that have scale, you have very little chance of getting something done. And even then, once you get something done, you've got to get to the insurers and get the rules changed. There's a very interesting group down in Houston. John Arnold set it up and a bunch of people in it with the top maybe 15, I don't know, maybe top 35 research hospitals in the US, and they're sharing innovation across the board. And when someone comes up with something, they'll bring it to their partners. And if the broad network finds something to be particularly interesting, then that network, as a network, has a conversation with the insurers, which is different than an individual hospital trying to do so. So there are a lot of things like that, but if you're in a situation where the person who doesn't really want to innovate because they're pretty happy with the way it is in an industry where there are very few players, then scale is pretty powerful, because otherwise it's very hard for the small person to ever get through that limit. Maybe that's easy, the generalized case.
If anyone wants to ask a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself and you can go ahead and ask John.
I don't have a question, but I'm from a College of Veterinary Medicine, absolutely nothing to do with business, but I was intrigued by, the title of the talk and the thinking about innovation. And I just want to say how grateful I am. I learned a lot from this talk. I really appreciate it. I've written down some quotes that I will like to share, particular comment about school, being all about right and wrong versus doing better, because I try and teach that to our students and trainees and things. So I realize sometimes when you don't get questions, it feels like maybe there's not a lot of engagement or whatever, but that was really wonderful. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for joining us, because you're in a field that's particularly interesting for experimentation, I think. Because you have less regulation in a way. You can try things. You have less regulation, but more risk. And I got to share this one. This is a 30-second story, but it's worth it. I didn't do this one today, but one of my favorite stories about teaching about what not to do in experimentation. We invested in a company that took corn stalks up in Wisconsin. We bleached them, and we turned them into bedding. We used it as a substitute for cedar in horse stalls. And we built a world-scale plant, and we were only a small investor, but we built a world-scale plant with a compost facility. We had a marketing campaign. We had a lot of shirts. I got a lot of shirts. In any event, we finally rolled it out and to the market, and we rolled it out to the first 5 customers. And of the 5, 2 of the horses colicked, and one of them died. And which is a really sad thing. But so we had to shut the venture down. We could have tested that before we built the plant. So
yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really, this is Cynthia Hipwell. I'm in the mechanical engineering department, and I actually teach a class called Developing an Innovation Mindset that teaches about experimentation. So I loved your talk. It was great. But I really especially liked how you use the math to show testing your most risky item first. I think it's a great way to convince engineers. I'm thinking it's a very insightful way to convince engineers who may think building it first or figuring out how to make it first is the most important thing to do. I think that mathematical way of saying something that Eric Ries said in a very, qualitative way is a really great way to express it, and I really enjoyed seeing that.
So I will edit this presentation and give you the right numbers if you want to use it. So we have really good examples, and when we do them in class, we have the students go through it, and they do all arithmetic, which makes it more powerful. And then talk it over amongst themselves. And we both do that sequencing example. We also do a one-to-many example, where you look at the return on the experiment, not just for one solution, but for multiple solutions. And that's very enlightening as well. That if it worked for one plant, it works for 10, for instance, that the return is just massively higher. And you think that's just obvious to anybody. It's not.
Well, and I think it's a great way to talk about a technology portfolio. I was at Seagate Technology for 2 decades and did a lot with our technology portfolio. And again, I think intuitively that's what we were doing. but you know, we would have probabilities of success and higher and lower. And I think getting people to understand a technology portfolio, I think is also a great way to consider that example.
Yeah, the big challenge is the numbers are always wrong. So
Yes. Well, that's where I think your point about developing intuition with practice is important too.
yeah, well, if you don't put any numbers down and you don't get any feedback, your intuition never gets any better. I mean,
Right.
without a feedback loop, I mean, it goes to usually the answer flows to the person with the biggest title. I'll just leave you with this thought, which is, as a practitioner for big companies over the years, I think one of for me, the biggest insight in the last 5 or 10 years was really studying the management methods in Silicon Valley. And I think they're underplayed. I think that they've developed a lot of really interesting management methods and different ways to think about problems. In many cases, explicitly, like 0 to 1 and otherwise, but other ones that are just kind of their norms, they're very powerful. They're very powerful, and big companies should not just adopt them wholesale, but understand them a little bit better. Like just a simple one, the whole idea of doing design is really, to me, very intuitive as a basic skill in experimentation. In many large companies, design is just, it's like, well, why would we bother with that? And you get 5 people together and try and develop a prototype in 5 days or something, and they go, well, that's a massive waste of time. And it's just hard, you know, because the cost of experimenting is known. The benefit is, this is really hard. When you experiment, you know it costs something. The benefit comes because you didn't do something stupid. Well, how do you count what you didn't do? Pretty hard. So you have to look over a long period of time, and over a period of time, your portfolio will be much more profitable, but it's a big leap. All right, I think that we're about done. Any other questions? Well, I will make my edits and get them to you. And if you all have any questions, any time on this, you can get my email. I think it's available, and just send it to me, and I'll be happy to answer it. So if anything comes to you, but hopefully it was useful for some of you. And if you find a few things you can take away and use in what you'd be great by me. And it was a time well spent. I appreciate the opportunity.
John, thank you very much. Thanks for spending time with us. We look forward to hosting you on campus soon.
Okay, thank you. Take care.